Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Business Law 1. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 17, which involves the introduction to sales and leases. And so some of the overall learning objectives that I would like for us to kind of take away for this chapter is to understand why the law of commercial transactions is separate from common law. We'll talk about what is meant by commercial transactions and how the UCC, which that's an acronym for Uniform Commercial Code, how it deals with commercial transactions. We'll talk about the nature and scope of Article 2 versus Article 2A types of transactions that come under the UCC. And then in general, we'll talk about obligations that the common law requires or imposes on parties to a UCC contract and how that's different from what the UCC requires. And so those are the overall kind of like primary learning objectives for this chapter. Anyway, so when we talk about the nature and form of sales, contracts for purely services or for real property, those are usually governed under the body of law referred to as common law. And so it could involve some statutory law, but historically common law has been kind of like the overall kind of like guiding, governing force for services and for real property. If we're talking about contracts for the sale of goods, so it could be new or used tangible property, then that's going to be governed by Article 2 of the Uniform Commercial Code. The UCC covers a variety of different articles, which if you take Business Law 2, we get into other articles. Like 3 and 4 deals with like financial types of transactions and notes. We get into Article 9, which deals with secure transactions, and so we'll be looking at other articles if you decide to take Business Law 2. But for Business Law 1, we predominantly just focus in on UCC Article 2, which is the sale of goods or physical things. The UCC obviously doesn't apply to services or real property, as I mentioned. It also does not apply to securities when we talk about like stocks and bonds. And it also does not apply to intellectual property. So, again, just trying to understand the scope of what we're looking at, excuse me, in this chapter. So when we talk about like, if we're looking at the issue of like nature and legality, a sale of goods is this present transfer of title in tangible property for a price. So whatever is negotiated. I give some examples here of types of transactions that are not sales. So a bailment is a transfer of possession but not title. So if you ever like rent a car, that's not a sale transaction. That's just you're getting permission to use that vehicle for the duration of whatever the contract period is, but then you have to return it. So that's a bailment. A gift is not a sale because technically it's a one-sided consideration event. So if I give you $1,000 and you don't have to do anything in return, that's a gift. That's not a contract sales type of transaction. And a contract for services, as I mentioned, that's not that's just an ordinary contract. That's not a transaction that's governed by the UCC. So again, because it's services only. The question comes into play though is what if you have in a contract, something that involves the sale of goods, but then it also does involve the sale or the transfer of services. What we do in that instance is we try and make a determination what is the dominant or primary purpose for this contract. So I'll give sometimes as an example, let's say you decide that you want to replace your computer. And so you go online, let's say you go to Dell.com, and so you order a computer, desktop, laptop, doesn't matter, 2-in-1, all the different choices out there. And let's say that in addition to purchasing the computer, you also get an extended, service agreement, so that if something goes wrong with the computer and it's outside the warranty period, you have coverage. And so the primary purpose of that contract, even though it has a product, a physical thing, plus a service component to it, its primary purpose for existence is that you need a computer. So Article 2 would be the one that would be the guiding force in interpreting any type of issue over that contract. Now, change the facts a little bit. Let's say that I take my computer in to be serviced, and let's just say I decide I don't want to actually buy a new computer. I just want to get it serviced. And let's say that I take it into, Office Depot or Office Max, Staples, whatever. And let's say that, they perform the service of like maybe giving it a tune-up, and they try and strip away any viruses that might be on there, or malware or anything that could possibly be on the hard drive, software related. And let's say they actually physically clean the computer. Maybe there's some keys that are sticky, so they actually clean it physically. And let's say while they're doing that, they discover that, maybe I have some damage to a hardware component. So maybe I need to replace my RAM or some other physical component, soundboard, whatever. And so, the primary purpose of that contract is a service. And so even though I may be getting physical, things like a new, RAM card or a new sound card, that's not really the primary purpose of the contract. So the UCC would not cover that transaction. It would be covered in, just traditional contract law, because it's primarily a service-based transaction. So that's what I mean when I talk about, what is the dominant purpose or focus for that type of transaction. When we talk about the formation of a sales contract, subject matter and quantity usually are required elements, although we have talked about in the past how those might be left blank for some reason. As long as there's a way of figuring out those variables in the future, that isn't necessarily a problem. If we're talking about an offer, though, and in particular a firm offer by a merchant, that's an irrevocable offer if it expresses an intent that it will be kept open for some period of time, and then it is signed by the merchant. So maybe it could be a manufacturer to wholesaler, wholesaler to retailer, manufacturer to retailer, doesn't matter the type of variations. But if it's a written offer where it says, consider this offer, you have 30 days to decide, and it's like signed by, the merchant that's making the offer, then at that point, you can't rescind it before the expiration date that you listed. So if I say this offer is good for the next 30 calendar days, and in 10 days I change my mind, I'm like, this is probably not a good idea. I'm going to be bound by that firm offer because it was a firm offer. It's in writing, and it's from a merchant to another business entity. If we're talking about the issue of additional terms, because that does come up, and so if we're dealing with non-merchants, so whether it's both parties are non-merchants or one party is a merchant and the other party is a non-merchant, any additional term is considered a counteroffer. And if you remember from the previous chapters we've covered, any counteroffer is a rejection of the offer originally stated, and then it is actually a new offer. It's a counteroffer. And then the party that originally made the offer now is in the role of, do I want to accept this counteroffer? If that makes sense. So we want to make sure there is a complete meeting of the minds if one or both of the parties is a non-merchant. If both parties are merchants, so, again, it's, manufacturer to wholesaler, wholesaler to retailer, or any other configuration. If there are, additional terms that vary from the original offer, as long as it does not materially change the duties of the other party, and the other party doesn't object in a timely fashion, then it's going to become folded in as part of the overall contract. So it could be used to supplement a otherwise, a complete offer. Maybe you just provide a little more detail in terms of what the expectation is. But it doesn't necessarily result in it being a counteroffer. If you are materially changing the original offer, then it's like the non-merchant example. You're going to have to kind of go through, okay, it's a rejection and it's a counter offer, and it has to be accepted by the person who originally made the offer to you. But absent that, if it doesn't materially change the duties of the other party, then it can potentially become part of the contract. Sometimes defense is the formation. We've talked about like capacity. So if someone is maybe underage, or if they have some sort of mental impairment, if it's a mistake or deception or illegality that's being asserted, those would be ways of backing out of contracts. The UCC also recognizes what is called unconscionability, and this is essentially a grossly unfair bargaining power that one party has with another party. So it's not a fair fight, so to speak, in terms of being able to truly negotiate the terms to a contract. And so unconscionability can pop up in a variety of ways, but the thing to look for is, does one party have a disproportionate amount of power and the other party lacks that power? So there really is only bargaining that's going on is a one-sided event. So that would be a trigger to be kind of thinking, okay, this seems like a situation that could potentially be unconscionable. If you can demonstrate unconscionability, that would be a defense to formation, and that would allow you to, in theory anyway, back out of a deal. The UCC does not require every term to be stated in a contract for that contract to be valid. So you can have some missing terms. Price can be left open as long as you have an explicit formula that states how price will be determined in the future. So usually the common example I give for that is gasoline. So if you're a gas station, you don't know what the price of gas is going to be, 6 months from now or 2 days from now. There could be variations. But in contracts, formulas are laid out so that it will be based on the price of crude oil per barrel, when you factor in the refinery costs, and that gives you your wholesale cost for fuel, and then you have taxes and other things that get added in for purchasers of the fuel. Some terms can be left open if it's based on past patterns of conduct. So if it's not a new contractual relationship, but maybe you've been dealing with this supplier, vendor, wholesaler, manufacturer for years, and after a while you just kind of call up the person and say, hey, Joe or Susie, I need 100 more units, ship them like normal. And so you don't have necessarily the specific details that maybe you did early on in that relationship. It just has become like a second nature thing. I know what they want. We'll ship it the same way like we have for the past several years. Modifications can be binding if they're voluntary. So again, just another kind of standard principle that gets applied to these types of agreements. When we talk about output versus requirements contracts, an output contract is a contract for the entire product produced by a seller in a given period of time. The flip side of that is a requirements contract, and that's a contract for the seller to sell whatever quantity the buyer needs. So again, maybe what you're essentially contracting over, but you don't know amounts yet. So let's say I own, maybe a 5,000 acres of forest, and I hire a logging company to come on my property and log the trees that are on there, kind of harvest them. And I'm going to pay them, or excuse me, they're going to pay me actually, because they're getting access to my forest. So I don't necessarily know what the quantity is. It's going to depend on how their ability to extract. And that could be based on a variety of things: the terrain, the weather, the time of year, all that stuff. And so, I can't necessarily say I want you to cut down 100 trees a day. Maybe one day it is 100, maybe the next day because of a snowstorm it's 10. Because of terrain it might be only 50 on average. So, I may not know the specific output necessarily. Likewise, the requirements contract is where, usually you're going to a supplier and saying, look, I want you to be the sole source of what I need. So for whatever inventory I need, I'll call you, and you're going to have to provide, the supply that I need. The key thing with a requirements contract is that if you're the seller, you really need to be able to meet with cyclical demand. There may be variation. Think of like toys. If you're a toy manufacturer, the big season for toys begins in like August to September through the holidays. And then once you get into like January through like maybe, April or May, the toy sales decrease because, it's not Christmas anymore. It's not the fall leading up to the holidays. And so you've got to be able to kind of smooth out that production capacity so that, there will be lean months where maybe you're not really shipping much, and then you'll be slammed in the fall, for like a good 4 or 5 months, and you've got to make sure you're able to meet the demand from customers if it's a requirements contract. If you have an issue at all with this, then don't enter into requirements contracts. And just specify, this is exactly, this is the quantity that I'm willing to produce in a given month, and then that's it. So these are just options. You don't have to abide by these. Let's see. Couple of final things in this chapter. So in terms of statute of frauds, remember that we've previously discussed this. If the value of a sales contract for goods is more than $500, you have to evidence that by a writing, even though the UCC is in the process of being revised so that $500 is going to be raised to $5,000. Until that does kind of completely go through and be adopted, it's still $500. Another thing regarding the form of the sales contract, you might have what's called a confirmation memorandum. And so this is, again, it's a flexible type of contract. It allows merchants to verbally agree to something, whether it's face-to-face, over the phone, Zoom, Skype, whatever. And that conversation is later followed up by a memo which summarizes, this is what we discussed on the phone or on our video chat. You're ordering, fill in the blank, so much quantity, this type of good, and you'll sign it and you'll physically get it delivered to the other party. So it could be by mail, FedEx, hand delivery, doesn't matter. And then at that point, the recipient has 10 calendar days in which to review it and make the decision, did we agree to this? And if everything's fine, they don't have to do anything. It automatically becomes a contract that's binding after 10 days. If there's a problem, if you're like, I don't remember agreeing to these terms, then you need to make that known to the other party in less than 10 days so that you can make changes to the agreement. So that confirmation memorandum, that's what that is all about. The key thing there is you got the 10-day rule, and you've got 10 days to object to any terms that are not correct. The last slide that I have for this chapter involves leasing of goods. So, Article 2 is anything and everything about the sale of goods, so physical things like inventory. If we're talking about the leasing of goods, this would be Article 2A. So it's a subset of Article 2. And so if you ever see a question or ever see an issue involving goods that are being leased, then it's automatically Article 2A. So, in terms of like the statute of frauds, if the subject of a Article 2A lease agreement is more than $1,000, then it has to be in writing. If it's under $1,000, it doesn't have to be in writing, which, as you know me, I've said, make sure you put things in writing. That's a way to avoid any type of ambiguity. But if it's more than $1,000, then it has to be in writing under Article 2A. There's a few different types of leases that can come under 2A. So there are consumer leases. So that's obviously any type of lease where it's designed for an individual, not another business. So if I go to Ace Hardware and I lease, let's say, a pressure washer cleaner so that I can clean my driveway or the side of my house, then, that obviously is going to be a consumer lease. And it doesn't have to be in writing as long as it's under $1,000. Commercial would be anything that's non-consumer use based. So maybe I have a business, I do lawn care, and maybe as an ancillary or supplemental service, I provide pressure cleaning services. So I go to, Ace Hardware, and I say, okay, I need to lease this equipment for my business. That would be a commercial lease. Finance lease is a kind of like a fairly intricate type transaction where you have three different parties to the transaction, where you have a lessor, and you have, which is like the financier, you have a lessee, which is the customer, and then you have a supplier. And usually the lessee or the customer directs the lessor or financer so that they can kind of indicate with the supplier, what the ultimate customer wants or needs. So anyway, hopefully this brief video has kind of shed a little bit of light on this chapter. If you have any questions, like normal, please feel free to message me. You can call, email, or text me anytime, and I'll be happy to get back with you as soon as I can. But have a good, safe, and productive rest of the day. Thank you so much.